And this is the last of the big telecommunications reviews, and Vertigan's produced several of them. This one's about markets and regulation, and not surprisingly, given the background people on the panel, it's very pro-competition. So they're advocating the disaggregation of the national broadband network into its various technology components. So there's a fibre fixed line component, obviously there's satellite, there's fixed wireless, there's the HFC networks, there's still lots of copper as well. And they're saying, break them up into business units and let them compete against each other. The problem with that is, we've got a long way down the track in terms of building a national fibre network. We've already sunk $9.5 billion in what has been spent so far to build a network which services about 2% of the population so far. And there's many, many billions more committed to deals with Telstra and Optus and the like. So it's very difficult, given how far we've gone down a particular track, to say, well, we'll stop that and we'll start again and we'll break it all up. The perennial issue in telecommunications in Australia has been the need to offer uniform pricing across a very large continent, with a very highly dispersed population, other than this very solid metro audiences, very dense metro audiences. So the issue has always been, how do you do that? Well, you do it by cross-subsidy. And the whole concept of the NBN was to internalise the cross-subsidy so that the metro users subsidised the rural and regional users. And the Vertigan Committee is saying, break the whole thing up and have an explicit subsidy, either directly off the budget or alternatively by immediately writing down the value of the assets in rural and regional Australia the minute they're operational, and having an industry-funded or taxpayer-funded levy to provide, to finance the cross-subsidy. That gets really complicated and messy, and no government, particularly this government, given the fiscal circumstances it finds itself in, is going to say, well, we're going to write a cheque, blank cheque, for a subsidy for rural and regional Australia. The previous Vertigan report, which was a cost-benefit analysis, put the net present value of that transfer, if you like, from metro to rural and regional Australia at between $4 and $5 billion. So we're actually talking, this is net present value terms, so in nominal terms it'd be very large numbers. You're talking very large numbers for a treasurer, for instance, to get his mind around. And so Malcolm Turnbull's almost instantly said, well, we won't completely rule out, and somewhere down the track, decades down the track, maybe it could be revisited, but we're just not going to embrace that now. And that's the core of the report.
So with that subsidy model that the Vertigan Committee has recommended, it might be political suicide for the Abbott government to tack on an extra $5 billion to the budget, but could it actually represent a more efficient model of funding?
At a personal level, I'd much prefer, I think the Vertigan case is quite compelling, I'd much prefer a competitive landscape where people compete on the basis of infrastructure. At the moment, under the NBN scenario, it'll be a retail level of competition, and the wholesale, the owner of the network and the wholesale monopoly will be NBN Co. So you get this kind of competition at the margin, as opposed to true infrastructure-based competition, which does drive costs down, it drives consumer benefit, drives innovation. That would be a much better outcome. And had Stephen Conroy and Kevin Rudd commissioned the kind of reports that Malcolm Turnbull's commissioned, strategic reviews, cost-benefit analyses, regulatory architecture reviews, maybe we might have ended up somewhere in that competitive landscape. But they didn't. And we've spent the best part of $10 billion, and we're so far down a particular track, you can't now hit the pause button and say, well, can we completely redesign this thing from the ground up? The eggs have been broken and the omellette's cooking, right? And so it's just too late.
So there had been a lot of expectations built up around the release of this report, but I do have to question the actual point of this committee if there is so little that can be achieved once the NBN rollout's already begun.
Oh, look, I think the committee, because despite the fact the recommendations, the sort of thrust recommendations won't be picked up, the committee does actually touch on some quite sensitive points, and there'll be marginal areas where the review will be worthwhile. I don't think the expectations were that high. I think we all knew that you couldn't have a radical restructuring. And there are some things like setting up a new regulator to regulate the access regime for NBN and so on. There are some smaller issues, but fundamentally, I think everyone expected them to come up with a sort of competitive free market sort of approach, knowing that wouldn't be embraced. It was important, however, because some of the regulatory detail in the review, things like how you deal with TPG at the moment is rolling out fibre to the basement using an exemption in the legislation which supposedly protects the NBN monopoly. Government has to work out how to deal with that. Vertigan, of course, would encourage it because it's competition from infrastructure providers. Turnbull clearly is not going to go down that route, and is trying to put obstacles in the path of a TPG or anyone who might want to emulate them. So there will be detail. This is a 169-page report, so there's a lot of detail in it, and so there's some detail which would be useful. I think more to the point, the review having been done clears the way for the negotiations which have been occurring between NBN Co, Telstra, Optus and the government about a new deal. Remember, Telstra's got this 11 billion NPV deal as it stands. It's got contracts that protect it. That's got to be renegotiated, and it couldn't be renegotiated until you actually knew what the regulatory architecture would look like. So the government's response to Vertigan, and we'll see a more considered response somewhere before the end of the year, is fundamental to them being actually able to sign a deal. And so in that sense, the fact of the review now being handed over to government will allow that sort of commercial dealing to get to the pointy end and finally have a new deal signed.
Stephen Bartholomew from Business Spectator, thanks very much.
Thanks, Eric.